My colleagues, the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Capellas, and the CBC's Catherine Cullen in Ottawa. Vashi, I'll start with you just on what you might know about the announcement.
Well, what I know so far is that they're not hugely substantial, but it's sort of little bits and pieces. And I think it depends on sort of what your interests are. But I think definitely when it comes to parks, that is something, and historical sites, that is something that kind of joins in with so much of what we've been talking about over the past 4 or 5 days, and that is the reopening of various provinces, the relaxing of certain physical distancing restrictions. This is one of the only areas that the federal government has jurisdiction over. So my understanding is it will be, again, like so much else that we've heard about, a phased out approach. And you're right, probably not in time for the long weekend, but as the weather does warm up pretty much across the country over the next few weeks, there will at least be some more places that you can access to get outside. I think from my perspective, some of the things that I'm interested on to hear about from the Prime Minister include an update on 2 programs that we are waiting details for, and you spoke to Minister Morneau about both of them last night on the special, Rosie. The first is the wage subsidy program. We're supposed to get details about whether or not it's going to reopen, and the second is the commercial rent program. We are very quickly inching towards June 1st. A lot of provinces have not put a moratorium on commercial evictions. I know that you are hearing, as I am, daily from people who are worried about that reality, who run a business and are worried about that reality. It also depends on landlords taking part in the program, and everybody right now is just short on details. So there isn't a huge uptake, or that we have no formal numbers, but at least anecdotally I'm hearing a lot of landlords are saying, I don't know if I'm going to do this, and probably I won't because I don't have the details. So we are waiting for details on that program as well. And then to wrap all of that together, I think there's been some really interesting commentary over the past few days around the level of testing and what, if any, role the federal government has in ensuring that this country tests a whole lot more. There are examples in other jurisdictions of the world, even in the epicenter of this pandemic in Wuhan, where over the next 10 days, they're going to test 11 million people. We are nowhere near the goals that even individual provinces have set. In some instances, in the worst cases, in Ontario and Quebec, they're far short, even halfway there in Quebec, for example, to the goals that they have set themselves. And everybody, including the business community, including, epidemiologists, are saying we have to be far ahead of where we are right now to start relaxing physical distancing measures or reopening economies, a process which I should mention is underway in most provinces already at this point. So I think there is sort of some questions for the federal government, for the Prime Minister, about, is there a specific role for the federal government here? Is there a guideline that should be set by the federal government? I know the feds are helping increase capacity. I know that they are procuring those tests for provinces, or helping to. But do they have a role to play in ensuring the level of testing that needs to be done in order to reopen economies is actually being done, not just, pledging to be?
Right. Just to go back to the commercial rent situation, in case other people weren't watching last night, Minister Morneau did seem to suggest that he had some numbers. I'm not sure if those were concrete numbers or anecdotal numbers about uptake on the commercial rent. So I'd be interested to know more about that, because you're right. I think everyone's been hearing quite the opposite, that landlords aren't interested in it. He also made the point, which I hadn't really thought about before, was that because the federal government only has control over sort of mortgages, that's why it's limited in terms of how it provides the help from the federal level. And if more has to be done, then it has to come from the provincial jurisdiction. And I guess his suggestion was that landlords should do this because it at least guarantees them some money. But I think what I've been hearing, and I'm sure you too, Vashi, is that some landlords are saying, no, I want all the money. So if you don't take this program, then you just go and find me the money if you're the renter. And I think that's the disconnect there that I'm not sure they have addressed yet. And I'm not sure that I understood whether that was coming either from the minister.
Yeah, neither did I. And I would say, I think for some of the landlords, it's not even a casing, for some it's for sure I don't want to take less money. For others, it's I can't, right? We haven't been able to secure a mortgage deferral. And it's kind of confusing as well, because there's a tweet from Minister Morneau, I think it was last week, saying we're going to figure out a way to do this even for people without mortgages. I'm paraphrasing here. And so that also contributes, I don't know how they have numbers, because every landlord I talk to and every tenant I talk to is confused about the details. They don't have those details yet. There is a huge amount of provincial jurisdiction here, and I think there is a lot of pressure, particularly, for example, on the Ontario government to put a moratorium on evictions right now. But even they say, oh, we're waiting for the details and see how how this program works out before we make a decision on that.
I'll turn to Catherine for your thoughts now, but just also tell people that the Governor of the Bank of Canada was out this morning, Stephen Poloz, still the Governor for a couple more months, and it was not a super optimistic viewpoint on how things were going in the economy, certainly suggesting we're not out of the woods and pointing to potential bankruptcies, frankly, for many companies down the road.
Yeah, you saw him starting out by trying to offer that reassurance that we often hear from Stephen Poloz, that ultimately the structure of the Canadian economy is able to withstand this. He said, we were in good economic shape going into this situation, and there is reassurance to be had there. But he did note that this is probably the greatest financial challenge that most of us will see in our lifetimes, and there are challenges still to come. He was asked, for instance, how the Bank of Canada, what they think about the possibility of, we've talked so much about a second wave of the pandemic in terms of the effects that it might have on all of us in terms of our health. But he was asked, well, what about the second wave of the pandemic in terms of the impact on the economy, and essentially said, yes, we will have to adapt our forecasts if indeed that does happen. But again, this sense of the unknown, Rosemary, that we're all dealing with in so many different ways and shapes and forms, what the ultimate impact of all of this might be, it is certainly not going to be good. You heard Stephen Poloz talking about, for instance, pardon me, I've lost my train of thought there, but talking about debt, I was going to say.
Yes,
and the impact that is going to have in all of this. We know it is not good, but the exact shape of it's still to come.
Okay. I'm going to leave both of you just for a moment as we wait for the Prime Minister to emerge, to turn to another issue that we are expecting the Prime Minister to talk about in some capacity today, and certainly the Minister of Indigenous Services, who will be at the briefing at noon. And they have flagged this, obviously, before, that Indigenous communities in this country face a potentially more severe outcome when it comes to the pandemic. This past week, in fact, Minister Mark Miller, the Indigenous Services Minister, did say that Canada must improve its data collection efforts for First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities. And for more on this, I'm joined now by Janet Smiley. She's a research chair at St. Michael's Hospital and one of Canada's first Métis physicians, and she is in Toronto. Good to see you, Doctor. Thanks for making the time.
Hello, thanks for the invitation.
So how concerned are you about the lack of data around Indigenous people right now? Because it does seem as though we have one set of data for on-reserve Indigenous people and then sort of a vague notion of what might be happening in the population writ large.
Yeah, so I'm very concerned right now. And in fact, I've been very concerned and working with others to try to address this complicated problem since the onset of the pandemic here in Canada.
And why is this so hard to get? Why is it so complicated to try and collect this data? And how would it help?
Well, we're dealing with some historic and current policy legacies. So in order for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples to be identified in the existing COVID data sets, what needs to happen is they need to be in a context where they could be accurately identified as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis at testing or in testing follow-up. So in order to do that in a way that is respectful and safe, then we need to have an infrastructure and processes and partnerships. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist for most First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people where they live. There has been investment over time for First Nations people living on reserve and in the north, and for Inuit communities in the north, partnerships between the federal government and Inuit and First Nations leadership to set a kind of platform. And of course, there's shared health services, First Nations and Inuit leadership in the delivery of health services. These are contexts where Indigenous people are in the majority, so they may feel comfortable identifying, and they will be able to be identified. Unfortunately, because of things like the Indian Act, people who are living outside of First Nations communities, people who may not be recognized as status First Nations people, Métis people, and Inuit living in the South, live in a very different context, and the infrastructure there is very underdeveloped. So that's the complex problem.
Yeah, and the minister, I have to say, back on Saturday was very frank about it, that there was this data gap, that it was concerning, and that they did need to find a way to fix it. Give us a sense, though, in what way sort of the social determinants of health that we measure in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities are already sort of working against many of those communities when it comes to the pandemic.
Yeah, it's a tricky virus, and we're going to learn lots of lessons, and sometimes it magnifies things that are existing social challenges. So, of course, we know from H1N1 that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people have existing conditions, again, kind of linked to existing inequities and of distribution of health and social resources, like higher rates of chronic disease, overcrowded housing, and that happens in the cities as well. So a city like Toronto, where I live in, where there's 70,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, often actually only about 1 out of 5 of those people is actually participating in the census, and about 1 out of 3 of that population of 70,000, which is then the largest Indigenous population in the country, is experiencing housing shortage. We have a lot of strengths, though, too, as First Nations and Inuit and Métis people. We've had to live through many challenges, so we're incredibly adaptable, and we have very strong social networks. Those social networks, actually, I think, our adaptability and the existing goodwill and our ability to work in partnership across jurisdiction are what are going to get us through this.
I am going to talk with someone from La Loche a little bit later in the program, hopefully. But how concerned are you about that outbreak in La Loche and in the First Nation right beside it?
Of course, anytime, like as a Métis Cree person with family ties to Saskatchewan, this is, it strikes us as very concerning. But I do know those communities, and I know that there's a lot of strengths. There's a lot of very strong First Nations and Métis leaders, and a lot of goodwill. So I understand that everybody is working together. That's what's going to get us through, right? Strategic alliances, working together for the good of the people, and then actually kind of wise science, right, or wise practices. So, yeah, my heart goes out to those communities, but I feel confident because we've made it through many difficulties in the past. So there's that resilience and adaptability and history of communities coming together to address social challenge.
Let me ask one more question before the Prime Minister comes out of his front door here. If, you know, we're talking about fixing things that we see that aren't working throughout this pandemic in all sorts of different ways. If one of the things that was fixed was the federal government able to provide a different role in gathering information, how much would that help, I guess, keep people healthy and safer?
It would be wonderful for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people to be counted in to our public health systems, regardless of where they choose to live or where they need to live. So currently we're kind of faced with a federal jurisdictional hot potato, and unfortunately it's not only in the delivery of health services, it's also in our health information system. So I actually see an opportunity to kind of bridge that gap and recognize that we're all related, and it's very important to have this intelligence and information, and it should be led by Indigenous First Nations, Inuit, Métis leaders and Indigenous health service agencies, and then that's going to really help us moving forward and avoid situations like we have right now.
Doctor, really good of you to make the time and to let me pick your brain a little bit about this issue. Thank you so much. I do appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's Dr. Janet Smiley. She is in Toronto. We do know, of course, that yesterday the Minister of Crown and Indigenous Services, Crown and Indigenous Relations announced a $2.3 million for that area of northern Saskatchewan, La Loche and the First Nation, because obviously some additional support needs to go there given the number of cases that have happened either on the reserve or in the community of La Loche and have touched other people, Métis and other Dene who live off reserve. So we'll expect to hear more about that from the Prime Minister and from the Minister Minister at the noon briefing. I'll bring back Vashi Kapelis and Catherine Cullen as we wait for the Prime Minister, knowing I'll probably cut you off. I'll try and get to this anyway. Catherine, I did want to ask you about your story around the CERB or the CERB fraud, because it is something that the Vashi was talking to Minister Qualtrough about yesterday, and you had some other details in your stories yesterday too.
Yeah, we've been hearing from Mr. Qualtrough. We've heard from the Prime Minister himself that when it comes to catching people who may have been committing fraud by applying for the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, even if they haven't lost their job, even if they don't meet the criteria, but just going ahead and saying that they do, officials have said, listen, the cleanup is really going to be on the back end. And so we learned from the CRA yesterday that they're going to be introducing new measures. Rosemary, a notable one certainly is that they're going to be asking for more information from employers about when specifically Canadians were working this year. Normally, employers just hand out the information in your T4, right? A summary of the money that you've made this year. No, this time around, they're going to be asking employers, and they are still ironing out the details of this, but for a month-by-month accounting of what people were making over the course of the pandemic. They're going to compare that information to people who applied for the emergency response benefit and try to catch some inaccuracies there. One thing officials did say, and this also came up in Vashi's interview with Minister Qualtrough, though, is if you have been accessing the benefit and you shouldn't, the idea is going to be they want the money back. Will there be additional penalties for people who have willfully been dishonest in all of that? That is not where the focus is. And we've heard from the government time and time again, their real focus right now, it's about getting a lot of money out the door to a lot of people who are in need. This concern that some people are abusing the program does seem to be, in the grand scheme of things, a bit of a more minor one for them.
Okay, excellent timing, Catherine. The Prime Minister has just emerged from his front door. We'll talk to both of you after this. Here's the Prime Minister of Canada on this Thursday.
Good morning.
Over the last 2 weeks, we've seen our women and men in uniform step up to the plate again and again. In seniors' homes, in northern communities, they're there for where we need them most. And because they respond to the call of duty without hesitation, whenever they're called upon, it can be easy to forget the toll this work can take. Members of the Canadian Armed Forces have always been there to do tough, dangerous jobs. So after a lifetime of service, far too many veterans live with chronic pain. Today, we are launching the Chronic Pain Centre of Excellence for Canadian veterans at McMaster University. This centre will focus on national research, training, and education to provide veterans with the support they deserve. No one, least of all those who have worn the maple leaf, should be without the care they need. Later today, I'll also be meeting with nurses here in Ottawa to thank them for their outstanding work. I know I speak for all Canadians when I say that we are incredibly grateful to the women and men who are keeping us safe right now.
Our men and women in uniform have always been there for us, and we have to be there for them as well. Today, we are launching the Chronic Pain Centre of Excellence for Canadian veterans at McMaster University. That centre will focus on research, training, and education right across the country to provide our veterans with the services that they need. To all those who have served Canada, thank you. The entire country is grateful to you, and we will be there to support you.
Over the last 2 months, a lot of Canadians have faced very challenging situations and very difficult choices. Just take workers in the fisheries industry. You can't harvest lobster from inside your house. So that leaves you trying to figure out how to either space people out on a fishing boat or cancel your operations. It's not an easy call to make. On top of that, prices and demand have gone down, putting financial pressure on fishers and their families. Taken together, this adds up to a really tough time. So I want you to know that we're listening, that your local MPs are making sure your concerns are heard, and above all, that help is on the way. Today, I can announce that we are investing almost $470 million to support fish harvesters. First of all, we are creating the Fish Harvesters Benefit. If you're expecting a 25% drop in income this season, you'll get support to cover 75% of your losses, up to about $10,000. And as a reminder, if you qualify for the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy instead, remember that we'll be extending it beyond June. We're also introducing additional non-repayable grants of up to $10,000 for fish harvesters who own their own business and need support to bridge to better times. And for workers who are worried about next year, we will change employment insurance rules so that fish harvesters can apply for EI benefits based on the earnings of previous years. This all builds on the investments we've made for fish and seafood processors. And for farmers and aquaculture fisheries, we're also launching a $100 million Agriculture and Food Business Solutions Fund through Farm Credit Canada. This is yet another option to help agri-food companies facing unexpected financial strain. Whether you're a fisher, a food processor, or a farmer, we've got your back. And I know all Canadians do too. And to everyone who wants to show their support, buy Canadian. Pick up some Canadian cheese to help out a local dairy farmer. Have a fish fry or buy Canadian lobster. Not only will it taste great, but it'll help the people who keep putting food on our plates.
A number of industries are going through tough times right now, and the fisheries are no exception. Not only must people slow down or even stop all their activity to protect their workers, but prices and demand for these products has also declined. That's why we are introducing the Fish Harvester's Benefit. If you are a harvester who is expecting a 25% drop in your income this season, this measure will help you. It will cover up to 75% of your losses, up to about $10,000. And for people who are eligible to the emergency wage subsidy, we will be extending the program beyond June, as we announced last week. We will also be offering other non-repayable subsidies of a maximum value of $10,000 to fishers who are also owners of their own business and need help to come through these tough times. And for workers who are concerned about the coming year, we will be changing the employment insurance rules so that fishers can apply for EI based on their income from previous years. You are feeding our families. We are listening to what you need to get through this crisis, and we will be there for you. I would now like to talk about what we're doing to support the Indigenous peoples who have particular difficulties during this pandemic. We set aside $306 million to provide interest-free loans and non-repayable contributions to Indigenous businesses. With respect to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis students, we are providing targeted support of more than $75 million, as well as helping young people find a job in their community this summer. And for women and children, Indigenous women and children who are fleeing violence, we have invested $10 million in emergency shelters. We have made significant progress, but we know that there is still more to be done.
Since day one, our government has been engaging with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation leaders in the fight against this virus. In places like northern Saskatchewan that are dealing with COVID-19 outbreaks, it's become very clear that communities need this work to continue. That's why yesterday we announced support for the Meadow Lake Tribal Council and Métis Nation Saskatchewan for their pandemic response plan. Through this plan, we're partnering with communities to provide over $2.3 million for everything from food to supplies. We all want the same thing: to keep people safe. And we will continue coordinating to make sure that happens. I want to end today by recognizing that the May long weekend is coming up. It'll be different than normal because lots of places, including our national parks, are still closed. But this isn't forever. Canadians have been doing the right things these past many weeks, and that's why we can announce today some good news for the weeks ahead. As of the beginning of June, some national parks will be partially reopening so that people in the area can use trails and green spaces where physical distancing is possible. Getting fresh air is important, but we all have to be responsible about it. We have to be prepared to make adjustments as needed. That's why, with the weather getting better, we're bringing in new regulations on boating as of June 1st to protect vulnerable communities in the north. No pleasure craft will be permitted to operate in Canada's Arctic coastal waters or in the coastal areas of northern Quebec and Labrador. Of course, this ban does not include boats used for essential fishing and hunting or for local community use.
National parks will remain closed over the weekend, but some will be reopening as early as June 1st. You will be able to take advantage of outdoor trails and green spaces while still practicing physical distancing. But we must remain cautious, and we have to be ready to adjust to new circumstances. So, starting on June 1st, pleasure craft will not be able to operate in the coastal waters of the Canadian Arctic or the coastal areas of northern Quebec and Labrador. That's what we have to do in order to protect each other. It's important to remember that this will not be forever. If everyone does their part, we will get through this. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We'll now go to the phones for questions from the media. Just one question, one follow-up. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. First question, Janice Dixon, The Globe and Mail. Line open.
Hi, Prime Minister. My question is about the Canada-U.S. border. A Canadian and an expectant mother living here says border guards have twice refused her partner, an American citizen and the father of her baby, from crossing into the U.S., and the border guards told him being here for the birth of his son was non-essential. Do you think someone in this circumstance should be able to cross?
We know Canadians are making extraordinary sacrifices through this difficult time. Loved ones who are saying goodbye to their parents and grandparents via FaceTime because they can't see them in person. People living through very difficult distancing that is causing a real impact on people. Obviously, we're trying to make sure that people can do the things that are most essential. But even as we were grieving over the past weeks in Nova Scotia and elsewhere, we needed to make sure we were respecting the rules in place to keep people safe. I can understand the difficulty and the challenge that closing the borders to all but non-essential travel is causing on many, many families. We need to make sure that the decisions are taken that are going to protect people. I understand that different decisions could be made on a case-by-case basis, but what we are doing now is what we need to do to keep Canadians safe for the coming months and years.
A follow-up, Janice?
Yes, the American man I mentioned was told by an officer that the only way he could see his son is if his expecting partner was hit by a car and they needed someone to take care of the baby. Is there not any room for compassion in these cases? He wants to try again after his son is born. Do you have any advice for this specific example?
So we've seen families split up even internally in Canada because of COVID-19. It is difficult on everyone, and I can't comment on every case, obviously. But I do know that Canadians from coast to coast to coast are making tremendous sacrifices in order to protect their loved ones, their communities, their parents, their grandparents, and preventing our healthcare systems from getting overloaded.
Thank you. Next question, Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Jenny Pashagumskam, APTN. Line open.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. You mentioned something in French about Indigenous students and Indigenous women. I'm sorry I missed it. I was expecting a translation. Could you tell us what was said there?
We're making sure that students in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities get extra support. We're also investing in support for families women and children fleeing domestic violence in Indigenous communities. We've made a large number of investments in supporting Indigenous communities across this country through this pandemic because we recognize the level of vulnerability. And I can tell you that Minister Miller will be at the noon update, as he is every week, to highlight the initiatives we're moving forward on with Indigenous communities.
Follow-up, Jamie?
Yes. My follow-up is concerning the rapid tests that were supposed to be coming out a couple of weeks ago. I know Indigenous communities have tests, but they're not the rapid tests. What happened to that?
As was highlighted a number last week, I believe, there have been challenges around the rapid test that I believe an Ottawa company had put forward. They've gone back to try and improve them or repair them. We've seen many new technologies come forward in terms of helping, and we've moved very quickly on them, but it also requires us to adjust when things aren't working exactly the way they were hoped to be working. So I know people are working very hard to make sure that Indigenous communities and indeed remote northern communities get the testing capacity they need as quickly as possible, but we need to make sure they are reliable tests.
Thank you. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Catherine Lévesque, La Presse canadienne. À vous.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. I just want to come back to the wage subsidy that will be extended beyond June, and that there will be further details this week. Can you tell us now how long it will be extended? Well, we will have more to say about that tomorrow, I believe, but obviously businesses across the country want to have some certainty in order to be able to rehire their workers and know how they're going to be able to operate as the economy reopens. And the wage subsidy is a very important tool in terms of keeping the connection between employers and workers, and we want it to be as efficient and quick as possible. So yes, we will extend it, and we will have additional details to share with you very soon. Follow up? Yes. And what do you say to Canadians who are wondering what to do about their summer vacation? Should they stay in Canada? Some would like to travel between the provinces. And is the United States an option for them, or should it be forgotten about altogether for this summer? Well, I guess we all want to know what's going to be happening in the coming weeks and months. But the only thing we know now is that we have to do the right thing and continue to practice distancing, stay home as much as possible. That's the way we can protect ourselves and ensure that we can come out of this as quickly as possible. The decisions made by families with respect to this summer will depend to a great extent on the region or the province where they live and the rules that are in place starting in July. It's still a bit too early to predict what that will look like, but we know that this will not be a summer like others in the past. We're in a situation where families and individuals will have to make various decisions that will be different from what they expected 6 months before.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Louis-Samuel Perron, La Presse. À vous.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. Now, as the pandemic is worsening in Montreal, we're seeing that some parks will be reopening there on June 1st. What will the criteria be for that reopening? Well, obviously, we're seeing that right across the country there are various situations, and we will be matching our federal actions with respect to federal parks with those in the provinces. Now, the decisions will be made about those parks in various regions, but, for example, in the far north, near Indigenous communities, there's very little chance that they will open on June 1st. However, there are others that will be more accessible and less problematic, and they can open. We'll have more to say about that in the coming weeks as to which parks will be reopening, but our goal is to align our decisions with those being made by local and regional authorities regarding provincial provincial parks.
We know that this pandemic has hit very differently across the country, and therefore there will be different phases or different steps in reopening of national parks across the country. We will try and align with the local jurisdiction what the provincial parks nearby are going to be doing so that it is clearer for people in terms of what they can do in their own particular region. But for example, our Arctic parks won't be reopening anytime soon. Certain parks that are in close proximity to Indigenous communities will take a little longer to open because of vulnerabilities. We will have more to say in the coming week in terms of which parks will be opening up. But we know people are going to want to get outside. They're going to want to do that safely. So as of June 1st, we will be facilitating that to a certain extent, always staying careful and responsible in the way we do it.
Follow up? Yes, Mr. Trudeau, we have been seeing this morning in the National Post that when EDSC asks people to approve the applications for the benefit, they are not allowed to refuse them of people who may have voluntarily left their jobs. Well, I think Canadians recall the numbers we saw last week. Millions of Canadians have lost their jobs in recent months. Now, as a government, we decided to help those people and to help them quickly. That's what had to be done. If we had introduced a system that was demanding a complete check on every person's application each time, there are millions of Canadians who would still be waiting to receive the emergency response benefit. We know that 99% of Canadians who are applying under these programs really need the money. And it's not because the 1% of fraudsters that we're going to slow down or prevent millions of other Canadians from receiving the help that they so dearly need. We have introduced measures to counter fraud, and we will be ensuring that that happens in the coming months. But the priority now is to help Canadians that need help, and that's exactly what we've been doing.
I think people remember well the job numbers that came out just last week that showed that millions of Canadians have lost their jobs. We made the choice as a government from the very beginning that we would help those millions of Canadians. And getting that help to 99% of the Canadians who needed it quickly and rapidly, if it meant even accepting that 1 or 2% might make fraudulent claims, was the choice that we gladly made. We needed to get help to Canadians immediately, and that's what we did. If we had asked the public service to perform background checks on everyone applying for the CERB, we'd still be waiting to get those checks out. And people needed that money. Now they needed that money last month when we delivered it. So saying, we have put in strong measures to ensure that anyone who is trying to defraud the system will get caught and there will be consequences. But that was not our priority. Our priority was helping people immediately, and the fraud measures will kick in the coming months.
Kevin Gallagher with CTV News. Could you expand on what those measures or mechanisms are? And also, you said yesterday the CRA would be responsible for a lot of that with the CERB. They're also responsible for the wage subsidy. So is the CRA going to need more resources to tackle the potential fraud that has come from these vital federal programs during this pandemic?
Well over 7 million Canadians have applied for the CERB. Millions of Canadians are receiving the CERB. Millions of Canadians have lost their jobs. We needed to help them rapidly and efficiently. That means to get the CERB, people simply needed to fill out an attestation to make commitments that they were in a situation that they deserve to get the CERB. Of course, there's going to be a few people who will misrepresent themselves and try and defraud the situation. Defraud the situation. But we know that the priority was getting help to people who needed it. And that's exactly what we did, including by increasing the capacity of the federal government to deliver these checks and support CRA and other government workers. The choice we made was to get the money out to people immediately when they needed it, so we could do the social distanciation, so we could stay home in the way we needed to, and make sure that the fraudsters get caught as we move forward.
It didn't really answer if there was going to be more resources for the CRA to do this. I'm also wondering, as provinces start to reopen their economies, non-essential businesses start to open up, there are likely to be workers that are concerned about returning to work for their own safety. Either they're immunosuppressed, they have difficulty finding adequate childcare options, or perhaps they're unsatisfied with their workplace safety protocols because of the coronavirus. Will those workers have an option to remain on the CERB, for example, or other federal programs? What will happen to workers that have concerns over their safety but now might have to go back to work?
On the first part of your question, the measures we've put in have required the public service across this country to step up in extraordinary ways. And we're making sure that they get the support they need as they deliver in a rapid way, in a reliable way, the support that millions upon millions of Canadians are needing, and we need to thank them for the work they're doing. And of course, we will always make sure that they have the resources necessary to do the things that Canadians need them to do, and do them as incredibly well as they have been. As the economy begins to reopen, as people start looking at going back to work, there are going to be lots of questions about safety, about childcare, about next steps. And we're going to work very closely with the provinces, with industries, with employers, with people to give as much clarity as we possibly can. We're in an unprecedented situation. We're figuring this out step by step as we move forward, as we get into the next phases of this. But every step of the way, our focus is going to be on keeping people safe, first and foremost. That needs to be the priority that all Canadians put at the top of the list.
En français, s'il vous plaît, sur la sécurité des travailleurs.
On worker safety, please. In the coming weeks, there will be many questions asked as to how we can reopen the economy, how people can return to work, what's going to happen with daycare centers, and what is going to be done about individual issues. And we will be working very hard together to find answers to those questions. This is an unprecedented situation, and there are no easy answers. We will be collaborating, as we have been, with the provinces. We will be listening to Canadians' concerns and find the best way to ensure everyone's safety, while at the same time looking at a gradual reopening and recovery of the economy. Radio-Canada, good morning, Mr. Trudeau. We're seeing that the wage subsidy is not being used very much by the employers. The CERB seems to be harming that program. Do you think it's time to get rid of the CERB earlier than was expected? Well, the fact is that there are many people out there who have lost their jobs and have no access to the wage subsidy. So the CERB has a very important role to play. But as we said, by extending the federal wage subsidy, we are hoping that more and more employees will be rehired by their employer, so that we can focus on the recovery that is to come. We want to ensure that there is a direct connection between employees and employers, and we want to find the right ways to ensure that the recovery is quick and efficient. Now, could you not model it a little bit like employment insurance and allow people to get part of the CERB? Would that not be a better way to encourage people to actually work? Well, that is something we're looking at right now. It's all about determining how we can reopen the economy and how we can go from a situation where people are at home protecting themselves to one where they're going out, going back to work. And we need to figure out how we can modify certain programs, maybe extending other ones. So these are all questions we're looking at right now. But for now, we're still in an emergency, and we're still supporting people so that they can stay home and so that we can control the spread of the virus. And as we get closer to the next steps, we will, in fact, be changing those programs. But how? That remains to be seen. For now, we're saying that we're extending the wage subsidy because that will be key to keeping people at work.
Over Global News, I just want to pick up on talking earlier about workers and safety. More than 40 inspectors with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency are getting sick going to work in meat packing plants. I'm just wondering what the federal government is doing to protect these inspectors.
No, we know the situation is extremely difficult in many meat packing plants across the country. That has been a real challenge, and we always are trying to find that balance between assuring a safe and reliable food supply for Canadians, which is fundamental and necessary, while at the same time ensuring the protection of the workers who are there. That obviously includes the food inspectors, and we need to make sure that they have access to the right kinds of personal equipment, protection equipment, and the right conditions to keep them safe. As important as it is to keep our economy going and get food on the table, we also need to make sure we are prioritizing worker safety.
The union, just to follow up on that, the union representing these meat inspectors, they say that they've been giving a work or else order from the agency, and if they refuse to go to work, they will be disciplined. So I'm just wondering why they're being ordered to go to work if they don't feel safe.
I think getting that balance right is extremely important. We need to ensure that essential services like the food supply continue to flow to Canadians, but we need to make sure we're doing everything we can to keep workers safe, and we will continue to work with Labour, with industry, with provincial partners to make sure that both of those things are being done. Okay.
We know that we must continue to protect the food supply chain and ensure the safety of Canadians. That's critical, but it's also critical to ensure the safety of all workers. So we will continue to work with the unions and with the employers and the provinces to do everything we can right across the country so that everyone is working in safe conditions.
Hello, Prime Minister. Tom Perry, CBC. The WHO's emergencies chief, Dr. Michael Ryan, he was quoted today saying that this virus may never go away, that it could become just another endemic virus in our community. So I want to know, as a government, how do you plan for that kind of scenario? And you're loosening up some restrictions on national parks today. What do you say to Canadians who might hear this and think, well, things are never going to get back to normal?
I think we know that there are things that we took for granted last year and years before that have changed. We have seen this world change rapidly over the years. You used to be able to get on a plane without taking off your shoes first. I mean, we have seen measures brought in that have made shifts in our society, some for the better, some for the worse. COVID-19 will be one of those things that creates changes in our society. Our responsibility as a society, as governments, is to try and figure out how to minimize the negative impacts of those changes while maximizing the safety of Canadians. There will be adjustments, but reopening national parks, for example, on June 1st, means that we know that you can't prevent Canadians from going outside when the weather is nice. You just have to help them do it safely. Continue to impress upon them the need for physical distancing, recognize that certain areas are more vulnerable than others and will need to remain closed, but create opportunities for Canadians' well-being, for their mental health, while at the same time protecting their physical health. Getting that balance right is something we're doing in the short term, but obviously there'll be plenty of reflections over the coming months and indeed years about how we make sure that Canadians and people around the world are kept safe from this pandemic or from potential next pandemics.
We have to recognize that things will change in our world, even after the end of this pandemic and even after we have a vaccine. we will have learned lessons that will lead to changes in our behavior and changes in the way that we operate as a society and as a planet. At the same time, our responsibility as a society and a government is to minimize any disruption while maximizing protection and safety for all citizens. So it's a delicate balance that we will be seeking. Now, with respect to national parks, for example, we will be able to reopen some of them on June 1st, but we will also be encouraging people to continue to practice physical distancing. But we know that going outside, getting some air, and outdoor activities are important to people's health. And we want to ensure that we can allow them to do that more safely, so that people will not be vulnerable. There's no doubt that we will be reflecting on how we have to behave in the coming weeks and years, whether we have a vaccine or not. But for the time being, we're making the best possible decisions so that we can all have a better quality of life and all be safe.
And you've announced support for First Nations in their fight against COVID-19 today. I'd like to ask you about something that happened on Sunday in Saskatchewan. A First Nation there says that the RCMP interrupted an important ceremony over concerns about physical distancing. Premier Scott Moe says there can be no exceptions to the province's rules about public gatherings. What do you say?
I think Indigenous community leadership knows that we need to be keeping people safe, and we should be able to work with them to develop ways of continuing with important customs and practices for them in a way that abides by health recommendations. I think that's something for the leadership of the community to take on, and we, of course, will be happy to work with them. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Okay, that is the Prime Minister of Canada on this Thursday, giving us an update on his government's response to the pandemic. Today, the focus on fish harvesters, primarily, who had been waiting for some details after announcements around fish processing plants about a week ago. And then some additional news that we'd already talked about. The national parks will reopen as of June 1st. I'll bring in my colleagues, Vashi Capellas and Catherine Cullen, for some initial thoughts on what we heard there. I thought the first question Tom Perry asked, our colleague, was interesting because it allowed the Prime Minister to reflect a little bit on the fact that it is difficult for us to return to whatever this new normal is, and the government's job is to try and minimize risk. You don't have to talk about that, but I thought it was interesting to hear him reflect on how you make those decisions as a government, Vashi. Yeah,
and it actually follows, I think, what we've been hearing from premiers as well, and it is sort of almost like listening to the internal discussion in their heads, right? And I've during the day I listened to all the various premiers, and right now they're all sort of rolling out how they envision the economy looking, society looking over the coming months, and you hear them quite honestly most of the time actually say, we know we can't limit you from moving, right? You can't stay in your house forever. So then the next step is figuring out how do you address the desire of people to be outside when the weather is warmer, taking that as an example, but also still mitigate the risk for people in your province or in the country. And it sounds like, for example, with the parks, it will be very much done in concert with provinces. So if the national park is in Alberta, well, it's going to depend how Alberta has reopened parks there or what the caseload is there, that kind of thing. The Prime Minister said the details of that were coming I think he said it something like in the next week. A couple other things, Rosie, jumped out for me, and building on what you and Catherine were discussing prior to the press conference from the Prime Minister, and that is all of this conversation around the CERB. So that's the $2,000 people can access for 4 months, up to 4 months, if they've lost their job or have to stay home and can't work for whatever reason due to COVID-19. There is a big sort of political discussion happening right now about what happens after the 4 months is up. Do you find a way to transition away from the CERB, make it look something maybe more like EI, where it depends on how much you're working instead of it all being taken away if you earn $1 more than $1,000 a month? And there seemed to be maybe I read it as more willingness from the Prime Minister. He said that's an eventuality, like something is going to have to happen after. But he did reiterate that the idea that nothing's going to change right now, and that he still views the need for that kind of aid as acute. There are, though, other questions, and you referenced this with Catherine too, about the level of fraud or fraud occurring. And he was pretty direct today, saying that that's not going to happen. Finally direct, I should say, because he wasn't in the past few days, that that's not going to happen until after. The issue at hand is whether or not there was a quote-unquote memo written to bureaucrats who are in charge of these applications saying, even if you think it's fraudulent, keep going, still pay. The Minister of Employment, Carla Qualter, said it's not a memo, but it was written guidance in the case of the CERB. It doesn't yet, that guidance doesn't yet, for example, exist when it comes to the student benefit, which students can apply for tomorrow. They're going to have to assess how many people apply for that before they decide how they're going to proceed. But it's likely going to be something similar, just because the way you access that money through the CERA with a simple attestation is pretty similar as well. I think this stuff is, I think, very interesting, but it also just lends itself to that broader discussion about when we're thinking about what things look like over the coming months, apparently, the coming years, what is the government's role? What kind of financial aid is the most supportive of people who want to stay safe, but also want to go back to work or participate in the reopening of economies? And it really, we're not at the point right now where we have any concrete answers about what that assistance or that aid looks like 2 months down the road.
No, I will say, though, that he did say that the wage subsidy details will come tomorrow, the extension of the wage subsidy details. So we'll get a little bit more.
To that, yes.
Yeah, we do. Catherine, I would like to think the Prime Minister was more frank in his response because of your reporting, but who knows?
I like that idea too, Rosemary.
All right, let's go with it, yeah.
But it was interesting to see how, frankly, fired up he was getting in defense of the way that they have rolled out this program. There were a couple of things that I wanted to drill down on, notably the percentages. He said, we're not going to punish 99% of people if 1% of people seek to commit fraud. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because what we've heard from government officials is that overall the rate of fraud with government programs is below 1%. But there has been an acknowledgement, and got a few more details from the CRA officials I spoke to yesterday. There's been an acknowledgement that this is a program that's easier to defraud. You heard the Prime Minister talking about it. You just simply have to sign this attestation and say, yes, this applies to me. I want to receive the money. The official I spoke with yesterday said a more risky program, you might be seeing fraud in the levels of perhaps 2 or 3%. Now, consider that this is a $35 billion program, or that's the price tag they put on it so far, and we are asking questions about the nature of the various extensions of these programs. It could be a significant amount of money, but the Prime Minister making the point, listen, there are a lot of people in need. We put that first, and he's happy to stand by that decision. I would note some of the things that we have been talking about in terms of the people who might be accessing this program and aren't eligible. One of the concerns that has been raised time and time again is really the prospect of unforeseen consequences here. Perhaps some of the people who are accessing this money do feel a bit financially desperate in this uncertain time, even if they don't meet the criteria specifically. They really do feel that they're in need of this money. What they may not realize is that the money is taxable. And also, if you are a particularly low-income Canadian and you're receiving some other sort of government support to try to help you out, be it subsidized housing, be it the GST credit, that if you are taking in this extra income, that's going to show up in your taxes at the end of the year, and you could lose access to benefits. Certainly some of the people I've spoken to who deal with low-income Canadians are very concerned about what this might mean for them. So I think we can all take the Prime Minister's point that there are a lot of Canadians in need, that is where their focus is, but we also need to ask questions about what is going to happen to people who may have accessed this money. I would say as well, CRA officials telling us yesterday that the point is not going to be to penalize people who have been willfully dishonest, but rather just to get the money back if indeed they can. But again, clawbacks from low-income Canadians, what would that look like? Who specifically would they go after? I think there are more questions to be answered there.
Okay, thank you both very much. I'm going to come back to both of you if you don't mind. I'm going to get some reaction to at least part of the Prime Minister's announcement today, and that's in relation to fish harvesters. $470 million for them announced. Previously, they had announced a large chunk of change for fish processors, but this is the second part of that announcement that is much needed on the coastal communities of this country. Melanie Sonnenberg is the president of the Canadian Independent Fish Harvesters Federation, and she joins me from Grand Manan Island in New Brunswick. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
So $470 million and this specific benefit for fish harvesters. How big a difference will this make to people?
Well, this is a welcome announcement today. I mean, it's really good news for us. We're pleased to see that the government's made a commitment to the fishing industry. And the announcement itself acknowledges some of the challenges that the harvesters have had fitting into the current program. So all the way around the board, I mean, we're really happy about what we've heard today. Now, of course, we'll need to review the details and see how that unfolds, but certainly this is welcome news today.
From what I understand, one of the big concerns beyond just, needing some money right now as seasons had been pushed back, and obviously it's hard to sell things right now, was the issue around EI, which the Prime Minister addressed too, namely that you'll be able to apply for EI based on last year's income. How big a deal is that, Melanie?
It's a really big deal. I mean, given, what is turning out to be short seasons for some lobster fishing areas and some of the crab fisheries, this will be really, really critical as, the story itself is still unfolding in terms of the market access. So I think we have been asking for this as a federation for weeks, is that we have something that will recognize this gap that we saw right out of the gate. And certainly this should do that. And I also want to give a shout out to the Prime Minister for suggesting that folks eat some local Canadian grown products or harvested products in our case. That's going to be tremendously important too in terms of bridging the gap here as we go through this pandemic.
Well, I sure have no problem buying into that idea. Just give us a sense before I let you go of sort of the what people are dealing with in terms of loss, if you have a sense of that.
Well, the fishery is so diverse, and it's all relative. If you're an individual on your boat in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and you're getting ready to go fishing tomorrow, the uncertainty about the market is really, I think, has raised the anxiousness of the industry up. But that doesn't matter whether you're in BC or you're in Newfoundland. All of the harvesters across the country, because of all the unknowns, and it's the same for every sector, is, it's that uncertainty, and it's, how are you going to make ends meet? And I think, this announcement starts to address some of that. I mean, there's still things that we're going to want to talk about with government, and that is making sure that our new harvesters that have bought into the fishery, that they're protected, or people that have made big investments, they're going to have to be recognized here, and we're going to have to find a bridge for them in terms of some of the debt load that we have. But overall, I mean, it is for everybody, it's the unknown. And I don't think we're no different in this sector, that's for sure.
Okay, Melanie Sonnenberg in Grand Man in New Brunswick. Good of you to make the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Rosemary Barton. You're watching our special coverage here on CBC News Network of the Prime Minister's and the federal government's response to the pandemic. We're standing by at this hour for a briefing from public health officials and cabinet ministers with more details on what the Prime Minister gave us this morning. And as well, there is a virtual COVID committee hearing of parliamentarians and ministers as well, set to start at around 12:15. We're also standing by for a press conference at 1:30 Eastern from the Premier of Ontario. He is set to announce some details of phase 1 of the province's reopening plan. CBC News, though, has already learned a few of those details because CBC's Mike Crawley that's what he does. He's on the story live from the Ontario legislature. Mike, give us a sense of what we should expect from the Premier then.
No, thanks for the plug, Rosie. One thing I got to clarify is what I saw was a draft of a news release about today's announcement. So quite possible that things could change. And this thing was in such a draft form that it actually said on it, Ontario will begin stage 1 of its reopening on insert date here in the bracket. So we don't know when it's going to happen. What was on this news release, the two key sectors that were named are retail and construction. On the retail side of things, this proposed that retail shops that are not located in malls would be allowed to open. They would have to have some physical distancing rules in place, like the number of people per square foot, that kind of thing allowed in a shop at one time. On the construction side, there's been a certain amount of essential construction allowed to go ahead in Ontario, but non-essential construction would be freed up to go. A number of other things, pet groomers, veterinarians, household cleaning and maintenance, and some seasonal businesses could get going, golf courses, marinas. We're hearing there's going to be something in the way of a timeline for resumption of scheduled surgeries, which the government had said was going to happen. Didn't give any details about that. So still lots to find out about from the Premier's announcement at 1:30, but that's giving you a sense of the scope of what would reopen in this limited phase of reducing the COVID-19 restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to follow the pattern of a lot of other provinces, I have to say, in terms of how you do this. I do know, though, that the Premier has previously talked about the pressure he was under from golfers or golf lobbying groups, if such a thing exists. So do we feel like that actually had made a difference and that's something that we will see?
At the same time, though, you know, on the golf courses thing, if you look at it, if there's lots of space to stay away from others, other golfers if you're out there. So you can see how some outdoor type activities would be allowed to go ahead. Interesting thing that's in this draft of the news release, it proposes that individual sport competitions could go ahead, and the examples that were named were horse racing, track and field, and tennis. I'm a big tennis fan, so that could mean the Rogers Cup going ahead in Toronto in August, but with no stands no fans in the stands. So that's another one of the kinds of outdoor-related activities that could resume under this plan.
Okay, Mike Crawley, thank you for bringing us up to date on what we can expect in about an hour and a half time. Mike Crawley in Toronto there. As we wait for our press conference here at noon and then the federal COVID committee at around 12:15, do want to try to get in our next guest because overnight the federal government announced it's spending $2.3 million to deal with a COVID outbreak in northern Saskatchewan. The funds will be shared by provincial, municipal governments, as well as First Nations and the Métis Nation. And Glenn McCallum is the president of the Métis Nation in Saskatchewan, and we reached him in Saskatoon. Good to see you, Mr. McCallum. How are you doing?
Really well. Thank you very much.
Great. So tell me what we should know about the situation in northern Saskatchewan, in La Loche and outside of La Loche.
Well, maybe just a little background prior to giving you the update in regards to where we're at right now.
Of course.
We really acted really quickly in regards to the COVID-19 that came out early March for us, and we set up a task force within our office, and it's going really well. At our Provincial Métis Council conference calls and rolled out our programs, and the First Nations did the same. I'm very thankful for the federal government responding at that time to deal directly with the Métis Nation and the First Nations people, to be able to deal with the COVID-19 situation. And as you well know, some of the isolated communities in northern Saskatchewan had a tougher time. So they're very innovative thinkers, and what they come up with was monitoring points to be able to know who's coming and going. And right now, as we speak, there's quite a few communities that haven't had COVID-19. But for some, there has been, and one of them is the community of La Loche, like you mentioned. And other communities other incidents are popping up in different communities. But with the reaction that we gave right away, where we set up the monitoring points, really slowed down that process in regards to spreading the virus. So we're working with the province now, stepping up to the plate in regards to what is the best moving forward plan to be able to keep our citizens safe.
I know that in La Loche, for instance, there's a lot of people just going door to door to see how people are doing and potentially do tests. I know they've sent up mobile units in case people have to self-isolate if they don't have enough space in their own home. What will this money help you guys do in northern Saskatchewan? $2.3 million is a lot, but these are remote communities, so it's possible that you need a lot there.
Yes, we do need a lot. And like you say, you're absolutely right in regards to the lack of capacity facilities that we have. But La Loche, the mayor of La Loche, has been doing a great job, and the area director, Leonard Mongrand, have been doing a great job in regards to responding to the needs that we need to put in place. The Métis Nation has put resources in place, same as the First Nations, but because La Loche and there's a reserve not very far, so they're working together. So it really complements the efforts in regards to what we're doing. We're putting out, we put some trailers out there for people to use, and we'll continue. This money that's coming, the $2.3 million that is coming from the federal government, really helps to continue supporting communities that don't have the capability or the facilities to be able to isolate certain individuals that are been affected or just isolation where they could travel from out of province or from different communities. So it really helps.
How difficult is it right now? Because a lot of Saskatchewan is doing well with cases, and so the province is slowly reopening and allowing some things to open up. But meanwhile, you've got this, patch of a lot of cases, frankly, in northern Saskatchewan that's troubling. Does that mean that people are you preventing people from coming into the community? Is that what people are trying to do, either in La Loche or on the First Nation?
Let me say first, the province, when this started, reacted in a very positive way. That's why we don't have very much cases in central and southern Saskatchewan. But the reaction that the things that the North did weren't very well supported because we wanted to keep the community safe, and the mayors and the chiefs put monitoring points in place, and then we had to work together to be able to come to a point where we can complement each other. So as we began to do those monitoring points, it really slowed down. And there's a lot of isolation. In central and southern Saskatchewan, people have access to hospitals, but if you start going north, the communities are very isolated, 100 to 200 kilometers apart. And there's only, I believe there's one in hospital in La Loche and one in Isla Crosse, and that's it. The rest of the time we have to come north. So there's an NAD line, Northern Administrative District, and that's what the province is using as far as isolation in northern Saskatchewan. That's why those monitoring points are there, but we have to keep supporting with dollars to be able to keep them running, and it's going well. As a matter of fact, when I get off this interview, we'll be talking, the chief and I, Meadow Lake Tribal Council, Richard Ben and I have been working very closely together, and the mayors will be talking to the minister in regards to how can we better this plan and put our best foot forward, so to speak, in regards to what is the best interest of our people. The safety is number one. So we're continuing to do that, and recognizing that the North is a unique place with, it's isolated, like I say, and don't have the facilities that are needed, and there's more capacity that's needed to be able to support the North, and that's what's happening from the Métis and First Nations, and more importantly with the federal government.
Okay, Glenn McCallum, I wanted to make sure to get to you because it's an important story and need to make sure we're aware of what's happening in northern Saskatchewan. Thanks for making the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having us. Thank you.
Our pleasure, and stay safe and healthy. Yes, you too, sir. Glenn McCallum's the president of Métis Nation in Saskatchewan. All right, as we stand by and wait for our briefing from cabinet ministers, including the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, who will probably talk more about that. I'll bring in the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Capellas, and the CBC's Catherine Cullen. I'm just going to go. I think they're actually entering, so I'm not even going to do that because that's just terrible to do to you. All right, I'll come back to you towards the end if you don't mind. We'll start with this briefing today, but I will remind you that the COVID-19 committee also will get underway, so we'll bring you probably some of that first round of questions anyway that goes to the Prime Minister from opposition leaders or cabinet ministers. This is the Minister of Indigenous Services, Mark Miller. He's accompanied by the Public Health Officer in Indigenous Services as well. And as we were just talking about, the north of Saskatchewan got $2.3 million overnight to deal with that outbreak in northern Saskatchewan that has hit not only the community of La Loche, where there are many people from the Métis Nation, but also the neighboring First Nation, the Meadow Lake Tribal Council. So everyone's pitching in to work together. Here's the minister now.
Good day, everyone. We are here today mainly over a teleconference with Minister Jordan, Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, Minister Wilkinson, Minister of the Environment, and Tom Wong, Chief Medical Officer of Indigenous Services Canada. We will speak in the following order: Minister Jordan, Minister Wilkinson, Dr. Wong, and finally myself. Without further ado, Minister Jordan, please.
Bernadette. Minister Jordan. Okay. Let's go straight to Minister Wilkinson, and we'll go back to Bernadette. Minister Wilkinson.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Bonjour, hello. The Prime Minister announced this morning that of services at several national parks, national historic sites, marine conservation areas, and wildlife areas on June the 1st. The limited openings will align with guidance provided by respective provincial health authorities. It will not apply to all parks, so it will be important to check for the status of your local park. Ces ouvertures viseront à permettre.
These openings aim to enable locals to use and enjoy parks near their homes. With spring coming, it is important for Canadians to have spaces where they can exercise and discover nature in a manner that respects physical distancing requirements.
We all know how important it is to get outside and to be in nature. It is good for our mental and for our physical health. This partial reopening will allow visitors to have access to trails, grounds, day use areas, and green spaces where physical distancing is possible. Limited facilities such as washrooms and comfort stations will also be made available to visitors. I would emphasize that services will be very limited to begin with. As we move forward, we would hope to expand the range of available services, but this must be done in a thoughtful and a prudent manner, one that is consistent with putting priority on the safety of Canadians and, of course, on our Parks Canada staff. We must enjoy these places safely and follow the advice and guidance of public health experts. People should check ahead on the websites to plan their visit and prepare appropriately. Certainly follow us on social media for just-in-time updates. Thank you very much. Merci.
Okay, we'll go back to Minister Jordan and see if everything's working. Bernadette? Over to you, Minister Jordan.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. Hello, bonjour, quoi. The women and men who work in Canada's fish and seafood sector are the economic drivers of many of our coastal, Indigenous, and rural communities. They've been feeding Canadians for generations, and we need them to be able to continue to do so safely in these very challenging times. While hardship and uncertainty is felt across the country, the fishing sector faces challenges that are unique, and they require direct solutions. That's why today, our government is announcing $469 million in funding to establish the new Fish Harvester Benefit and the Fish Harvester Grant. This is the single largest investment to Canada's fisheries in nearly 20 years, ensuring that Canada's hardworking independent fish harvesters get the support they need now and while positioning the sector for a strong recovery. The new Fish Harvesters Benefit will provide up to $267 million income support for eligible self-employed fish harvesters and chairperson's crew who cannot access the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. Support will be provided to those who experience losses of 25% or more during the 2020 tax year, up to a maximum individual equivalent of $847 per week for up to 12 weeks. The new Fish Harvester Grant has dedicated funding for up to $201 million in non-repayable support to licensed self-employed fish harvesters who cannot access the Canada Emergency Business Account. They can use these funds to cover the costs of running their fishing businesses, including increases in costs due to the health and safety requirements. Lastly, we will also EI rules so that fish harvesters can apply for EI benefits based on earnings from last year. We'll support you now and into the future. We continue to assess and respond to the impacts of COVID-19 and take additional actions as needed to support Canadians, stabilize the economy, and mitigate the impacts of this pandemic. Canadian harvesters are resilient and determined, and today I am urging Canadians to show their support by purchasing more of our high-quality, sustainably sourced products at your local grocer. There's never been a better time to buy a Canadian fish and seafood product. Our harvesters, many of who will be heading out for their spring season tomorrow, can continue their vital work knowing that the Government of Canada is here to support them every step of the way. Thank you. Merci. Walalan.
Merci, Madame la Ministre. Tom, Chief Medical Officer, Indigenous Services Canada.
I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. As of May 13th, a total of 185 cases have been reported among First Nations living on reserve in provinces. This represents less than 0.3% of reported Canadian cases, whereas First Nations on reserve in Canada constitutes about 1.5% of the Canadian population. Of the 185 cases, 63% have recovered. 18 cases, that is 10%, required hospitalizations. And there have been 2 deaths on reserve. The First Nations on reserve case fatality rate is currently at 1% and is below the Canadian overall case fatality rate of 7%. We are cautiously optimistic that nationally, the First Nations on reserve curve continues to show signs of flattening if there's no future spread of COVID in First Nations communities. This has been accomplished by impressive First Nations leadership and decisive actions in using public health measures, including lockdown, physical distancing, prompt isolation, avoiding crowds, hand and cough hygiene, and it has paid off. Beyond infections in First Nations living on reserve, there are many more cases elsewhere in Canada involving First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, with COVID-19 being reported to the provinces and territories. Timely epidemiological data collected by Indigenous Services Canada is only available for First Nations living on reserve. We need help from provincial and territorial health departments and agencies to support Indigenous peoples to get a comprehensive epidemiological picture beyond First Nations on reserve. As different jurisdictions are entering into the early stage of reopening of the economy, it is important to recognize the inherent rights and self-determination of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Communities will decide what is best for them in the unique context of remoteness, access to health services, living conditions, and the prevalence of underlying medical conditions. Les communautés décideront de ce qui leur convient.
Communities will decide what suits them best in the unique context of remoteness, access to health services, living conditions, and the prevalence of medical conditions. However, we must remain extremely vigilant during the gradual reopening of the economy in order to prevent introduction of this virus to Indigenous communities.
Merci, merci, and thank you.
Thank you, Tom. As today is Indigenous Nurses Day, I would like to begin by saying thank you, merci, miigwech, marcy, nakumik, hi nyawan, Wilalin, Haishka, Marcy Cho, to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis nurses for their incredible work caring for patients and providing culturally safe healthcare during the COVID-19 pandemic. As we are learning from past experiences responding to pandemics in Canada, and specifically in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities during the H1N1 virus, we need to recognize and understand that they have a higher risk of being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. The First Nations and Inuit Health Branch continues to provide effective, sustainable, and culturally appropriate health programs and services that contribute to the reduction of gaps in health status between First Nations and Inuit and other Canadians. And I would like to remind everyone that improving the health of Indigenous people in Canada is a shared responsibility between federal, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous partners. Our goal continues to be to work with all in partnership to ensure Indigenous communities receive the care they need. By working together, we're saving lives. As Tom mentioned, as of May 13th, we've seen 185 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in First Nations community, 16 cases in Nunavik in northern Quebec, and 117 representing the proportion that the Chief Medical Officer stated are considered recovered. We've also been closely monitoring the situation in northwestern Saskatchewan, and to support communities in response to the outbreak, we will be providing $2.3 million in funding, which will go towards the Northwest Saskatchewan Pandemic Response Plan. This pandemic plan is a collective effort between First Nations, Métis, municipal, provincial, and federal partners. Meadow Lake Tribal Council and Métis Nation Saskatchewan have undertaken exemplary collaboration in leading the response to this significant outbreak. The funds will be jointly administered and will complement the ongoing community-based efforts to conquer COVID in the region and support security checkpoints and impacted community measures to address food security, provision of home care supplies, and enhancement of regional and community capacity, which includes youth engagement. We will continue to work with the Northwest Communities Incident Command Center, including provincial health authorities, First Nation and Métis communities in the area to support their efforts through increased access to testing, enhanced surveillance, strong contact tracing, and infection prevention and control measures. We're focused on the health response that will save lives, and I want to reassure Indigenous leadership that we are committed to supporting Indigenous communities and activating their pandemic plans and providing the support in collaboration with provinces and territories that best respond to each community's needs in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I would also like to give a quick update on Szechuan First Nation. The Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry has advised us that risk of flooding has been downgraded to moderate to low along the Albany River, and this is good news. While the downgrade is encouraging, we stand ready to activate contingency plans if needed. Repatriation of Szechuan residents who are on the land began yesterday, for which we have supported air transportation back to the community to ensure the health and safety of all members. We will continue to work in close coordination with community leadership, the province, Muskegowik Council, and other federal departments to address concerns related to flooding and plans for evacuation in the area. Lorsqu'il s'agit de combattre la propagation de virus,
when it comes to fighting the spread of this virus, urban and on-reserve First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities are facing unique challenges. Since the beginning of the pandemic, local organizations as well as Indigenous leadership have been working 24/7 to provide services to Indigenous communities. We know that COVID-19 has placed increased stress on operations for these organizations. In response to these needs, we have taken immediate measures to support these organizations. Through the Indigenous Community Support Fund, $15 million have been earmarked for regional Indigenous organizations as well as urban and on-reserve organizations. These organizations can also receive funds from other federal initiatives under the Economic Response Plan, such as Social Development Canada, and increased funding for women's shelter and centers to help sexual assault victims. Additional funding for food banks have also been placed at the disposal of Indigenous organizations in order to meet urgent needs. In addition to federal funding, individuals and organizations can also support these organizations through charitable donations, and this is critical. However, more support is necessary. We are working with communities to identify the support that they need and the support that they're asking for. And we're working closely with government partners to explore further possibilities to assist urban and on-reserve Indigenous organizations.
Acknowledge that summer is fast approaching, a time of year that is usually marked by sacred ceremonies and events that are very important to Indigenous peoples across the country. While banning sun dances, potlatches, among other Indigenous cultural and spiritual practices is unfortunately a dark stain on Canada's history, I want to ensure everyone listening that even in the face of a historic pandemic, Canada must not and will not prohibit these important practices. Any decision to cancel or postpone these events is a decision that is solely at the discretion of the community's leadership. I would, however, like to reiterate the importance of the public health measures that we have been repeating since the beginning of this pandemic. Together, we can slow the spread of COVID-19 by making a conscious effort to keep a physical distance between each other, avoiding crowded spaces and contact with people at higher risk, such as elders. First Nations leadership will ultimately decide how to proceed safely in this context, and I would like to encourage leaders to develop guidelines in alignment with the best available public health practice to adapt these ceremonies. In closing, Tuesday marked 150 years since Manitoba joined Confederation under the leadership of Louis Riel and the Métis people. For thousands of years, Manitoba has been home to a number of distinct Indigenous communities, such as the Assiniboine Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, Dene, and Inuit. The Métis Nation would also form its own distinct culture that would further shape Manitoba's identity and play a pivotal role in establishing Manitoba as part of Confederation. This is an opportunity for Manitobans and all Canadians to reflect on the past and present and to look forward to the bright future of the province. Part of our present and future is walking the path of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. We must also acknowledge past wrongs and chart a new path forward based on the affirmation of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. While COVID-19 is impacting the celebrations that are fitting for such a significant anniversary, we encourage Canadians from coast to coast to coast to learn more about Manitoba's history and culture and to participate in the many virtual Manitoba 150 celebrations and activities being offered online. Miigwech, Nakumik, Marcy, thank you. Merci à tous.
On est maintenant prêt à prendre les questions. Thank you, Minister. We'll start on the phone with 3 questions, then turn to the room. 1 question, 1 follow-up. Opérateur.
Thank you. Merci. If you have a question, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad. Si vous avez une question, faites étoile 1 sur votre téléphone à clavier. The first question is Brett Forrester from APTN National News. Please go ahead. The line is now open.
Hello, everyone. Minister Miller, on May 9th, you encouraged vigilance, saying remoteness may have delayed the onset of COVID-19 in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. How concerned should we be about a second wave as provinces begin to loosen up restrictions?
We should be very concerned, Brett. As we know, until such time as a vaccine is found and distributed and administered, the risk of second and third waves is very real. And while remoteness has sheltered a number of communities, thanks most importantly to the leadership that medical staff in the community, medical leadership, health officers, and political leadership have ensured, we need to remain vigilant, and the challenge that we all face as a society, as restrictions are lifted, it is very difficult from a political perspective to ask Indigenous peoples to do something that we ourselves would not be prepared to do. And that reflection is very important as we look at the various measures that need to be taken and supporting individual leadership in taking the decisions that are proper to them and that they see are the most important to their communities. And so with that is required a constant dialogue, constant vigilance, and interaction with Indigenous Services Canada, provincial authorities, to make sure that the best medical recommendations are being followed in the community. That will pose with it, as you will recognize, Brett, a number of challenges, whether it is people seeking to come in and out of communities and observing restrictions that aren't necessarily observed in urban settings. And I think that's something that we will be turning our minds to and have started to turn our minds to as we attempt to provide additional supports, air continuity, food security, all supports that Indigenous communities need to weather this global pandemic.
Brett, follow-up.
Yep, thank you. We heard at committee that urban Indigenous people often deal with a number of risk factors. Some of them are the same as folks on reserve, such as overcrowding and underlying conditions, among others. What is your message to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who live in cities and may be feeling ignored or a bit left behind right now?
Well, as we've traced the chart of this, or the course of this epidemic, Brett, some things are becoming very obvious. One, that this epidemic hits the most vulnerable, particularly those living in crowding conditions, particularly an older segment of the population, and we are learning from this. We know the social determinants of health that have rendered Indigenous communities on a less equal footing than non-Indigenous communities, and that isn't restricted to on reserve. And indeed, in certain urban settings, there are populations that you could say are even more vulnerable. We have deployed, as I mentioned in my speech, $15 million to support, among other things, 94 organizations, the National Friendship Center. We've acknowledged that that is absolutely not sufficient. We are working hard to provide additional supports. There are other programs that have been deployed. Minister Monsef, among others, has dedicated a number of financial resources to supporting women's shelters, in particular to support those in need, about $40 million, $10 million of which was dedicated, I would note, to Indigenous shelters on reserve. There are a number of other initiatives. The Verin chez soi, I'm at a loss to translate it in my mind at this point, but also supports for homeless initiatives that have been announced by the Prime Minister, as well as food security initiatives. All this to say, Brett, is that we absolutely acknowledge that this is not enough. There is no way to pinpoint exactly what the outcome of this epidemic will be. And so we stand ready to support, and we will act proactively to support those communities that are best in need, and the service providers who do the great job with very little resources to support those communities in need.
Thank you, Minister. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. La prochaine question, Philippe Vincent.
The next question, Philippe Vincent Choisy from Radio-Canada. Your line is open. Question. Hello, Mr. Miller. My first question is for you. Last week, you said you were concerned about the possible reopening in Montreal. You were concerned about a second wave and an increase in deaths. We recently learned that CMN schools will remain closed until September, and childcare services will be closed until at least the 1st of June. No decision has been made so far about the opening of retail in Montreal. Does this step by the Quebec government reassure you at all? Answer. Thank you, Philippe Vincent. From the beginning, both our Prime Minister and the Quebec Premier have based their political decisions on scientific data. And sometimes these policy decisions have been very difficult to make in real time. We all recognize what is occurring in Montreal, along with the concerns that I expressed about people dying in terrible conditions. That is something that's still occurring, and we're not out of the woods yet. So I congratulate the Legault government on its decision to defer this reopening. Of course, we are still closely monitoring the epidemic curve. Decisions can have an impact in several weeks. This is a virus, so the decisions we make today can have repercussions that won't show up right away, but only in a week or more. If mistakes are made, it's not a matter of blaming people, it's a matter of recognizing that we're all making difficult decisions in real time. And if ultimately it's necessary to change decisions, well, that should be done based on solid data. And I would also like to pay tribute to our Canadian Armed Forces to help people who are in a very vulnerable setting. That work will continue until people find themselves in a safe position once again. I hope that answers the question. Follow-up question? Yes. Another concern. You must have heard from a lot of business people in Montreal, for example, who are saying that the CERB is leading to a situation where some businesses are having trouble rehiring. The wage subsidy may not be as much as they hoped for. My question, will CERB be over after the 4 months? Or are you considering modifying it and making it more flexible after the 4 months are up to encourage people to go back to work? Will the CERB just be completely over after the 4-month period, or are you thinking of modifying it? Answer. In all real-time decision-making, with the type of economic impacts that you described, it's clear that we need to make sure that we can readjust and modify our decisions when we see that there is a situation with perverse incentives. I don't think that people receiving the CERB would necessarily refuse to work. People want to work. Job support was announced a couple weeks ago, and we need to allow that to have its impact over time, trace the economic effects, and ultimately modify our approach if necessary. Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from Andrea Gunn from the Chronicle Herald. Please go ahead. Your line's now open.
Hi, Minister. My question is for Minister Jordan. I am wondering if there needs to be any legislation passed for these benefits for fishers, and if so, how long we can expect to wait, or how long they can expect to wait before they can start seeing money for certain things, such as the wage benefit. And also have a follow-up question.
So there is, thanks Andrea for the question. There is no legislation that's required for this. We are working right now around the clock to make sure that we can get these benefits out as quickly as possible, because we know how important it is to make sure that fisheries has the support that they need and that they've been very much looking for. So we're working really hard to make sure that we get that out as quickly as possible.
My second question is will it be available for, like, if somebody doesn't want to go fishing because they're too worried about being in close quarters, they don't have any trusted family members that they're fishing with that they're certain don't have COVID or aren't going to expose them to COVID, will they be available? Will they be eligible for this benefit?
So these benefits are threefold. First of all, to make sure that people who no longer qualify for Fisher's EI are able to use their income from last year in order to continue their EI, as well as making sure that they're able to access the wage subsidy equivalent, that they do not qualify because of the unique nature of their business. And then, of course, having the grant in order to make sure that they can meet the needs that they have immediately to address concerns that they have. It's a $10,000 grant. These are all things we're working on and making sure that people have the supports that they need to go fishing, to make sure for the long term that they're able to collect their EI. It's been something that we heard a lot about from fishers for the last couple of months, and that's why we're making sure that we have those supports in place for them.
Thank you, Minister. We'll now turn to the room, starting with Mr. Gallagher.
Kevin Gallagher with CTV News. My question is for Minister Miller. You've already commented on that $15 million for off-reserve Inuit First Nations Métis is inadequate, but I'd also like you to comment on the judicial review filed by the Congress for Aboriginal Peoples with the Federal Court of Canada, saying the funding is inadequate and discriminatory for that same group of people.
Thanks, Kevin. It's an important question. I would like to preface my answer by saying I'm in no position to dictate to any organization how to exercise their legal rights. And so that is absolutely their right, and I respect it. We have moved from the very beginning to distribute money in the urban context to service providers that are on the front lines, and we haven't funded, per se, any national organization as such. And so the question in determining the funding was really to get it out to the people that needed the most at that point in time, knowing that there was a $15 million bucket that Indigenous Services Canada administers. Given that, I would say that CAP did receive an amount of $250,000, and my understanding from committee yesterday that was their intention to return the funds. But that said, I don't have any particular comment on the way they exercise their rights, and indeed that is it is their right to do so.
Can you give me an understanding of the ventilator capacity of First Nations? What is the strategy if there is an increase in cases and hospitalizations that would require that type of medical intervention? It's a major concern in big urban centers, but I imagine that ventilators are very difficult to come by in isolated First Nations.
Thank you for the question. One of the key things that for us, it is so important to make sure that we protect the most vulnerable. The way to approach, the ventilation needs has to be a well thought out planned process. For example, it is very unsafe to have ventilators in nursing stations or in remote areas. Why? because you need specialists. You need intensive care trained specialists in medicine and in nursing. You need respiratory therapists. Those are all specialists, and they are very hard, to come by. To actually be in remote and isolated areas. Even in urban or semi-urban areas, there's a shortage of those specialists. So therefore, the way to approach this is to ensure that we work with provinces and territories to increase the capacity of existing hospitals so that they have more beds, they have more ICU beds, in case that there's a need, to actually use those beds. Also, from a prevention standpoint, in addition to all the public health measures that we've been talking about, also the need to try to identify for high-risk individuals, such as elderly, for example, have a very low threshold to make sure that should they become sick, it would be at the very, very early stage to actually try to actually support them to actually move to a center where it's closer to the hospital should they need that type of tertiary care. Thank you. Yeah.
Is the strategy, though, I'm sorry, is there a strategy it sounds to me that people who are on a remote First Nation that might need that type of medical intervention, a ventilator, they would have to be transported then to a major center. Is that right? So not, maybe the major center is probably overstating it, but a hospital that is equipped, right?
That is correct. Yes.
So is that already planned? What's the plan for that? Is that already budgeted for? How would that transportation work? But I'm just wondering if you could answer that.
Yeah, that's already been planned for in collaboration with provinces and territories in the provincial healthcare system.
So I think there's a general question I think you're asking about the implementation of a pandemic plan for communities that are more remote or difficult to access. There's about 96 First Nation communities that you can only fly into and 50 Inuit. That's part of a generalized approach when it comes to healthcare generally. There are some communities where it's more advisable to fly out to give birth, for example, or transport out of the community. When you look at the implementation of a pandemic and the plans that are attached to it that communities have, depending on the capacity, demographics, the number of medical personnel in the community, there's been a concerted approach to figure out when it makes more sense to fly someone out for medical interventions, including use of ventilators. Tom has explained the intricacies around having the personnel that are trained to be able to use those devices, but it's part of a more general discussion and comment. We have a technical briefing actually this afternoon that you're more than welcome to participate to that can go into a little more detail about that, because it's part of a more generalized plan of using hubs and getting people out of those communities as quickly as possible through medevacs and back into more regional health centers where we can have those facilities and the properly trained people to use them, and then get people back into community in a safe way. So I'd encourage you, Kevin, to participate in that if you could.
Thank you, Minister. Just a reminder that you have colleagues.
Okay, we are going to pull away from this federal briefing with the Minister Mark Miller and Bernadette Jordan, the Minister of Fisheries and Ocean. They were talking primarily about the announcements today, $2.5 million for northern Saskatchewan to deal with an outbreak there, and then a significant amount of money, $470 million for fish harvesters who had been waiting for some additional support. I will bring in my colleagues, Vashi Kapelis and Catherine Cullen, just to help me wrap up where we're at today. I would say two things happened while we were listening to that. In Montreal, at the top of the hour, we are expecting that the Premier will push back opening dates for schools and other things again, realizing that Montreal, it continues to be really the hot spot in this country for the pandemic. And Donald Trump as well said that a decision on funding from the United States to the WHO will come soon, or some decision on how the United States is going to interact with the WHO moving forward, which of course is very important given that the United States had suspended funding and they are the largest contributor to the WHO. Not sure where you want to go with any of that, Vashi.
I'll pick up on both. I'm fascinated to see what the president might have to say about the WHO. I was under the impression that the decision had already been made. I think it was a few weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were sitting here while the president announced that the U.S. would suspend its funding to the WHO. The president has been critical, very critical in recent weeks, maybe the last month, about the WHO's reliance on data coming out of China. Of course, the president himself at the end of January was very complimentary towards China, but that that posture has certainly changed. Curious to see if this means that funding will resume or if there are any conditions attached to that. So we'll be watching for that announcement. And then the one more close to home that I think is really relevant to a number of people watching, definitely we've heard from them, people who live in Montreal, which you're absolutely right, Rosie, has become basically the epicenter of the virus and of the pandemic in Quebec. They are going to delay, for example, the reopening of schools, not just a week as it had already been pushed back, but until the fall, specifically in Montreal. My understanding is, and I could be wrong, but I thought that Premier Legault was touring with the mayor earlier today throughout much of Montreal. We know some of the CHLSDs, the long-term care homes in Montreal, have been particularly hard hit as well. So not necessarily a huge surprise that this announcement would be coming, given that 2 weeks ago when the Premier was first saying that schools would reopen, there was a ton of surprise, really, just given the caseload, the counts. We're still into the high triple digits every day in Quebec, and so much of that is happening in Montreal. So definitely going to watch for that press conference at 1 o'clock Eastern to see what the rationale is and what some of the further implications are, because we do know, I've talked to some parents in Gatineau who have their kids back in school this week, Montreal will be a very different story.
Yeah, that's for sure. And maybe I'll get Catherine to talk more about that too, because you used to report in Montreal. It is partly the mayor, I think, of Montreal who has been pushing back pretty forcefully against the Premier's idea that things could reopen normally, when we know that there's 141 or so outbreaks in long-term care centers, and testing is still nowhere near where it should be in the province or the city, for that matter.
Yeah, and to pick up on testing in particular, we know that the province has set targets for itself that it seems, failed to reach up until this point. And so it's very interesting to hear this, what I believe is a scoop from our Radio-Canada colleague, Martine Biron, saying no school until September, no service de garde, child care until at least June 1st, and that the decision is still yet to be made when it comes to how Montreal is going to deal with businesses. What I thought was so interesting in that particular news conference was the response by Minister Miller, who is an MP for Ville-Marie, the downtown core of Montreal. It was interesting to see a little bit of a shift between what he was saying over the course of the weekend when he was asked about what was going on in Montreal, and then how he responded to this news from Radio-Canada. On the weekend, he was asked about his concerns and his fears, and he said, "I am concerned that people will continue to die in indignity in great numbers, if we do not address this situation, and if we are too quick in opening things back up." In deconfinement is the term that seems to gain popularity in Montreal. And today you heard really quite a fair bit of praise and a lot of understanding, I think, too, for the Legault government, saying even if things go wrong, it's not to say that this is about blame or that it's anyone's fault in particular, but we all need to work together to make the best decisions possible. Minister Miller saying we're on the same page vis-a-vis wanting to be guided by science. It is a difficult line, I think, that federal officials are trying to walk here, express some concern, but at the same time not seen to be overstepping, overbearing, whatnot. So certainly a positive reaction from Minister Miller, and we're all going to want to hear more about how François Legault explains this decision today.
For sure, and if I'm allowed to plug my own things, we do discuss it on my podcast today, Elamine and I, on Party Lines, on why things are so different on the island of Montreal, as well as how things look in the United States. If you're unfamiliar with the topic, it's a good place to start. Okay, I sort of embarrassed for plugging that now, so I will say you can watch Vashi on Power and Politics later at 5 Eastern, and Catherine Cullen on The National. Thank you both very much for your help with our coverage. Appreciate it.